The Captain's Paradox. There were tales of the sea that whispered through time, stories of ghost ships appearing where no vessel should be, of men vanishing into the mist never to be seen again, of captains who defied the ocean and were swallowed by something far worse than the depths. Among these legends, none were more infamous than the disappearance of Captain Henry Morgan. Some claimed he had sailed too close to the Devil's Triangle and paid the price. Others believed he had been cursed by the Spanish, his greed finally catching up to him in the form of an unseen force that dragged him to the abyss. But the truth was far stranger than any tale whispered in the dim candlelight of a Caribbean tavern. It was the summer of 1671 when Morgan last set foot on the known world. The Caribbean sun hung low in the sky, burning deep amber as the infamous privateer stood at the bow of his flagship, Satisfaction, surveying the horizon. The sea was still, almost unnaturally so, as if the ocean itself had paused to watch what was about to unfold. His men were below, drinking themselves into oblivion, the scent of spiced rum thick in the humid air. They had reason to celebrate. After all, they had just taken Panama, looted its riches, and humiliated the Spanish crown. But Morgan could not shake the unease that coiled in his gut. For weeks now, something had been wrong. It had started subtly, the compass in his cabin spinning wildly before snapping back to true north, shadows moving strangely across the deck, the eerie feeling that someone, or something, was watching from just beyond the horizon. And then there was the storm, a storm unlike any he had ever seen, forming out of nothing, tearing across the water with unnatural speed. It had lasted less than an hour, but when it cleared, Morgan realized something was missing. The sky was different. The stars, those faithful beacons of every sailor's journey, were not where they should be. That was the first sign. The second came 2 days later, when they found the ship. It appeared just before dawn. A massive galleon, black as the deepest trench, floating on waters that should have swallowed it whole. No flag, no movement, just a silent specter on the waves. Morgan had seen many things in his life: Spanish warships, cursed islands, storms that could tear a man apart. But this was different. The crew whispered of omens, of death and damnation. Some refused to board, spitting over the side of the ship, making signs of protection against whatever evil had birthed the vessel. But Morgan was not a man who cowered at shadows. With a handful of his best men, he rowed toward the ship, the silence between them louder than any cannon fire. As they climbed aboard, the first thing they noticed was the cold. Not the damp chill of the sea, but a deeper cold, something unnatural. The ship should have been abandoned, its decks rotted, its sails torn. But everything was perfect, too perfect. The ropes were freshly coiled, the cannons polished, the deck free of debris. But there were no signs of life. No crew, no food, no bodies. And then they found the mirror. It was in the captain's quarters, a grand thing, nearly 7 feet tall, framed in gold so bright it seemed untouched by time. But the glass was wrong. It did not reflect as it should. When Morgan stepped forward, he did not see his own face staring back at him. He saw the sea, the ship, his crew, but not as they were. The ship was burning, torn apart by an unseen force. The sky above was black, swirling, a gaping wound in the heavens. And his men were screaming, reaching for something just beyond the frame, their eyes wide with terror. And then the reflection moved. Morgan had not moved, but his reflection had. It turned its head, locking eyes with him, and in that moment, something ancient and unknowable stared back. The mirror cracked, the sound like thunder splitting the heavens. The ship groaned, the boards beneath their feet twisting as if they were alive. The air grew thick, suffocating, the weight of 1,000 unseen hands pressing against their chests. Morgan turned to his men, shouting for them to move, to run, but it was too late. The void had already opened. The sea below them rippled, not with water, but with something far darker. A hole, vast and endless, swallowing the world in silence. Morgan had time for one last breath before it took him. There was no sea, no sky, no ship, only darkness. And in that darkness, a whisper. "Captain Morgan, welcome to the unknown." Morgan awoke to silence. Not the familiar hush of the ocean at dawn, nor the muffled stillness of a ship waiting for the tide. This was deeper, hollow, a void where even the sound of his own breath seemed muted. He pushed himself up, the surface beneath him smooth and unyielding. Not wood, not sand, but something cold, something lifeless. The sky above was the first thing he noticed. It was wrong. Not black, not blue, but something between, shifting in hues his mind couldn't name. There was no sun, no moon, no stars, just an expanse of color that pulsed like a living thing. And then he saw the city. Not a port, not a colony, not the stone and wood structures of the world he had known. This was something else. A skyline of towers stretched into the void, their edges blurring, as if they were half-formed. The streets below shimmered with strange lights, twisting in patterns he could not understand. Shapes moved between the buildings, figures, distant and silent, walking without purpose, their faces hidden. Morgan's pulse pounded in his ears. This was no place for a man like him. He turned, searching for anything familiar, anything real. But there was nothing. The sea was gone. The satisfaction was gone. His men gone. Only he remained. A ripple passed through the ground beneath him, distorting the world for a brief moment. The skyline shifted, bending, as if reality itself was unstable. The colors overhead darkened, a faint hum filling the air. Morgan braced himself, his instinct screaming of danger. And then the figures turned. Dozens of them, silent, watching. They were not men, not as he understood men to be. Their shapes were human, but their skin was smooth, featureless, their eyes glowing faintly as they observed him. Morgan's hand reached for his cutlass, but his belt was empty, his pistols gone. One of the figures stepped forward, tilting its head as if examining him. It raised a hand, and Morgan saw something shimmer at its fingertips, a small device, pulsing with soft blue light. The moment the figure activated it, the hum in the air grew louder. Morgan staggered as something pulled at him, not physically, but deeper. A tug beneath the skin, as if something was unraveling inside him. Memories flickered. A battle at sea. A Spanish governor begging for mercy. The weight of gold in his hands. And then, something else. A vision of himself standing on the deck of a ship that was not his, beneath a sky that should not be. A glimpse of something beyond the world he knew. Machines soaring through the air. Lights that never flickered. Buildings that scraped the heavens. Morgan's breath hitched. This was not just another place. It was another time, and he was not supposed to be here. The figure stepped closer, the light from its device pulsing faster. Morgan's mind reeled as the visions came faster. Timelines bending, colliding, splitting apart like shattered glass. His name whispered through them. Morgan. Morgan does not belong. His jaw clenched. No man told Henry Morgan where he did or did not belong. The force pulling at him intensified, a weight pressing down on his chest. The figures were trying to extract something, to take something from him. And then, instinct took over. Morgan lunged. With the strength of a man who had fought storms, cannon fire, and kings, he grabbed the device from the figure's hand and crushed it beneath his boot. The hum cut off instantly. The world shuddered. The figures stepped back, their movements slower now, hesitant. Morgan didn't know what he had done, but it had given him time, and time was the only advantage he needed. He turned and ran. The streets were empty, the structures around him shifting as he moved. Some buildings flickered, disappearing and reappearing, as if struggling to remain in place. The farther he ran, the more unstable the world became. His instinct screamed at him to find something, anything, that could tell him where he was. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A ship. Not a ship of wood and sails, but something else. Something sleek, metallic, resting atop a platform of glowing lines. It was the only thing in this fractured world that seemed solid, real. Morgan didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward it, the air growing heavier with every step. The ground beneath him cracked, light spilling through the fissures. The figures did not follow. They simply watched. And as he reached the base of the ship, gasping for breath, he heard the voice again. Not a whisper this time. Not a memory. A command. Captain Morgan, this is your last chance to comply. The sky darkened. The ground shook. Morgan looked up at the ship, at the strange markings along its hull. One stood out among the rest. A symbol. A brand he had seen before, in a different time, on a different kind of vessel. PepsiCo. His mind reeled. A joke? A mistake? Or something deeper? Evidence of a world where the past, the present, and the future had collapsed into one. There was no time to think. Morgan grabbed onto the ship's hull, hauling himself up as the world beneath him disintegrated. He had survived the wrath of kings, the fury of the sea. Whatever waited for him inside this vessel, he would face it. Because if there was one thing Captain Morgan knew how to do, it was to take what he wanted, even from time itself. Morgan pulled himself onto the strange vessel, his breath ragged. The surface beneath him was smooth and cold, unlike any ship he had ever known. No wooden planks, no sails, no rigging. Only seamless metal that pulsed with an eerie glow. The hum of energy filled the air, a vibration that settled deep in his bones. The ship was alive. Beneath him, the world crumbled. The streets twisted, buildings collapsing in slow motion, dissolving into streams of floating particles that spiraled upward like embers caught in the wind. The figures who had watched him did not run. They simply faded, their bodies unraveling into thin air. Morgan exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the ship. What in God's name had he stepped into? Then, the ship moved, not with the sway of ocean waves, nor the creak of shifting wood. This was different. Silent, smooth, unnatural. It lifted effortlessly, rising above the collapsing city, propelled by an unseen force. Morgan staggered, reaching out for something to hold on to, but the surface was devoid of ropes, railings, anything familiar. A door slid open beside him. Morgan turned sharply, fists clenched. Beyond the threshold, the ship's interior stretched into an impossible space, larger than it should have been, lined with walls that shimmered like liquid metal. The air smelled strange, clean, sharp, filled with an undercurrent of something he couldn't name. A voice echoed from within. Captain Morgan, enter. Morgan hesitated. The voice was unlike any he had heard, calm, mechanical, without accent or warmth. And yet, it knew his name. His jaw tightened. He had faced storms that could tear a ship apart, stared down the barrels of Spanish muskets, walked into enemy fortresses with nothing but a cutlass and the promise of death. This was no different. Morgan stepped inside. The door sealed behind him with a whisper. The hum in the air grew stronger. Morgan walked forward cautiously, his boots echoing against the sleek floor. There were no crew members, no signs of life, only corridors that twisted in impossible angles, leading to places that should not exist. Then, The walls flickered. Images flashed before him, scenes from his own life. He saw himself leading men into battle, the cannon fire illuminating his face in the night. He saw the satisfaction sailing through an open sea, the wind whipping through his hair. He saw Panama burning, the Spanish governor cursing his name. And then, something else, things he had never seen. A city of glass and steel, towering above an ocean that was not the one he knew. Machines moving without horses, without men. A great war unfolding, not with muskets, but with fire that rained from the sky. And at the center of it all, himself, but older, dressed in strange clothes, standing before a council of men who wore no crowns, yet commanded more power than any king. The images vanished. Morgan's breath came fast and uneven. His hands trembled at his sides. What had he just seen? And why, by all that was holy, was he in it? A doorway at the end of the corridor opened, revealing a massive chamber. At its center stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, waiting. Morgan stepped forward. "You have traveled further than any man before you," the figure said. Its voice was deep, steady. "And yet, you do not understand." Morgan's hands curled into fists. "Then enlighten me." The figure tilted its head slightly. Then, with a flicker, the shadows peeled away, revealing the truth. Morgan staggered back. The man before him was himself, older, weathered, eyes sharper, colder. A deep scar ran down the side of his face, cutting through his brow. His stance was relaxed, but there was no mistaking the power behind it. The older Morgan studied him, expression unreadable. "Welcome, Captain," he said. "To the end of history." The ship trembled. A low vibration rippled through the air, as if the very fabric of time had begun to fray. Morgan clenched his jaw. "What sorcery is this?" The older Morgan exhaled, stepping closer. "No sorcery," he said. "Only time." He gestured toward the walls, and the images returned. Cities rising and falling, wars fought and forgotten, empires crumbling to dust. The past, the present, the future, all at once. Morgan's stomach turned. This is madness." "No," the older Morgan said. "This is the truth." He turned, pacing slowly. "You were never meant to disappear, Henry. You were meant to change history. But something went wrong." Morgan scowled. "And what, pray tell, is that?" The older Morgan stopped, leveling him with a cold gaze. "You died." The words landed like a cannon blast. Morgan's breath hitched. "That's impossible." The older Morgan studied him carefully. "Is it? Then tell me, how long have you been running? How long since you last saw the ocean? Since you felt the wind in your hair?" Morgan opened his mouth, but no words came. He couldn't answer. How long had it been? The days blurred. The moments twisted. He had lost time, lost sense of everything. The older Morgan took a step forward. "This is a fracture," he said. "A mistake. Your death was not meant to happen when it did. The timeline is trying to correct itself." Morgan swallowed hard. "And what happens if it succeeds?" The older Morgan's expression darkened. "Then we both cease to exist." Silence stretched between them. Morgan glanced at the walls again, watching history shift before his eyes. A war he had never fought, a future he had never seen, a name that should have been erased, still spoken. He looked back at his older self. "What must I do?" The ship groaned, its lights flickering. The hum in the air deepened, like a warning. The older Morgan reached into his coat and pulled out something small. A compass, not a normal one. Its needle spun erratically, its face covered in symbols not of this world. He pressed it into Morgan's hand. "Find the origin." Morgan frowned. "The origin of what?" The older Morgan's jaw tightened. "The moment you were erased." The ship lurched violently. The walls flickered. A deep roar echoed through the chamber. The fracture was collapsing. Morgan gripped the compass tightly, his heart pounding. One chance, one path, find the origin, undo his own death, and in doing so, rewrite time itself. The ship trembled violently, its walls flickering between solidity and nothingness. Morgan braced himself as the hum in the air grew into a roar, the very fabric of reality unraveling around him. His older self stood firm, eyes locked onto him. "There isn't much time," he said. "Take the compass. Follow it. It will lead you to the moment that must be undone." Morgan looked down at the device in his hand. The compass was unlike any he had ever seen. Its needle spinning wildly, its markings shifting, refusing to be read. Another shudder racked the ship, and a deep voice echoed from the walls themselves. "Temporal collapse imminent. Anomaly containment required." The older Morgan exhaled sharply. "They're coming." Morgan lifted his head. "Who?" Before his question could be answered, the chamber split apart. The walls tore open like fragile cloth, revealing a swirling abyss beyond. A tunnel of fractured time, moments colliding in a kaleidoscope of past, present, and future. Through the chaos, figures emerged. They were not men. They were shadows, tall, elongated, their bodies shifting like liquid smoke. No eyes, no mouths, only silhouettes that pulsed with an unnatural, otherworldly light. The Keepers. Morgan knew them without knowing how. They were the architects of time, the silent force that maintained the order of history. And they had come to correct the mistake that was Henry Morgan. One of them raised a hand, and a surge of energy ripped through the air, striking the older Morgan with inhuman force. He staggered but did not fall. Morgan turned to him, gripping the compass tightly. "What do I do?" His older self gritted his teeth, blood trickling from his mouth. "Jump," he rasped. "Now." Morgan hesitated. Another blast of energy slammed into the chamber, tearing through the floor. His older self locked eyes with him, a knowing smile playing at his lips. "Rewrite it, Henry. Live." And then, the world collapsed. Morgan fell into the void. Not through air, not through water, but through time itself. The tunnel of history twisted around him, shifting too fast to comprehend. He caught glimpses, fragments of his own past, scattered and broken. His childhood in Wales, staring at the sea for the first time. His first battle, the clash of steel ringing in his ears. The night Panama burned, the city crumbling in fire and screams. And then, finally, the moment of his death. Morgan landed hard on wooden planks, the impact sending pain lancing through his body. The scent of salt and gunpowder filled his nostrils. He knew this place. He was back aboard the Satisfaction. The deck was chaos, flames licking at the sails, men shouting as cannon fire ripped through the hull. The Spanish had found them. Morgan pushed himself up, his muscles aching. He looked down at the compass in his hand. The needle had stopped spinning, pointing straight ahead, to himself. There, standing near the wheel, was him. Not the older version from the ship, not a reflection. The Henry Morgan of this moment, living his final minutes. Morgan's breath caught in his throat. He watched as his past self barked orders, sword in hand, his face grim with determination. And then, he saw it. A shadow, standing just beyond the chaos. A keeper. It was waiting. Morgan's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a battle. It was an execution. The keeper raised its hand. The air around Morgan's past self shimmered. This was the moment. His erasure had nothing to do with battle, with fate, with history. It had been taken from him. No. Morgan snarled, lunging forward. Time slowed. The keeper's hand descended, and Morgan slammed into his past self, knocking them both aside just as the blast struck. The energy tore through the deck, But Morgan didn't stop to see what happened. He grabbed his past self, their eyes locking. For a single, impossible second, Henry Morgan looked at Henry Morgan. Then, reality broke apart. Darkness. Silence. Then, a heartbeat. Then, waves. Morgan gasped awake, coughing up seawater. The sun was blinding, the heat searing his skin. His body ached, his muscles weak. He was lying on a beach, alive. He groaned, pushing himself up, his hands sinking into warm sand. The sound of waves filled his ears, rhythmic, steady. He turned his head. A ship rocked gently in the shallows. His ship, the Satisfaction. His heart pounded. He was back. Not in the void, not in the broken city, not in the keeper's grasp. The world was whole again, and so was he. Morgan sat in the sand, his breath uneven, the salt air filling his lungs. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore was real, tangible, more real than anything he had experienced in what felt like an eternity. He was alive, but something was wrong. His fingers dug into the sand, gripping it, grounding himself in the moment. The Satisfaction was there, swaying in the shallows, just as it had been before that fateful night. Smoke still rose from its damaged sails, the scars of battle evident. The Spanish had found them, attacked them, but this time he had survived. Had he truly undone his erasure? Morgan stood, his legs unsteady. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the coastline. It was familiar, yet unfamiliar. He had been here before, hadn't he? The feeling crept over him like a shadow, an unease he could not name. He clenched his jaw and strode toward the ship, wading into the water. If his men were still aboard, if time had been restored, then they would remember. They would tell him what had happened. But as he climbed onto the deck, a chill ran down his spine. The ship was silent, not empty. Bodies littered the deck, some moving weakly, others unmoving. His men had fought hard. They had suffered. But there was no celebration, no voices calling his name, no relief. They looked at him, and in their eyes, he saw fear. Morgan frowned. "What are you staring at?" His voice came rough, cracked from the salt. No one answered. A younger sailor, barely past boyhood, scrambled to his feet. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he took a cautious step back. "Captain," he said hesitantly. Morgan narrowed his eyes. What's the matter with you?" The boy swallowed hard. We saw you die." Morgan's blood ran cold. He turned sharply to the others, looking for confirmation. Some averted their gaze, others still too weak from battle to react. But those who could look at him did so with haunted expressions. "We pulled you from the wreckage," the boy continued. "You weren't breathing. We buried you." Morgan's stomach twisted. He clenched his fists, feeling his pulse beneath his skin, the ache in his ribs from the fight, the sun burning against his back. He was here. He was real. And yet, "We buried you," the boy repeated, voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Morgan exhaled slowly. He had rewritten time, but time had not forgotten. That night, Morgan sat in his cabin, staring at his reflection in the polished steel of his cutlass. The flickering lantern cast deep shadows across his face. He looked the same, felt the same, but the compass told him otherwise. It still rested in his palm, its needle now perfectly still. It pointed not north, not south, but inward, to himself. His mind flashed back to the moment in the void, the ship, the other him, the one who had given him the compass, the one who had told him to rewrite history. Was that man gone now? Had he been erased? Or had Morgan simply taken his place? He did not know, but he knew one thing. Time had been tampered with, and it was watching. Days passed, then weeks. Morgan reclaimed his place at the helm of the Satisfaction, leading his men once more through the waters of the Caribbean. But things were different. The sea whispered to him. The wind carried voices he did not recognize. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet, he would wake to the sensation of being watched. He would sit up, grip his cutlass, scan the room. Nothing. But then, just before drifting back to sleep, he would hear it. A voice. His own. Echoing from the darkness. Years later, Morgan's name became legend. Songs were sung of his victories, tales spun of his cunning. His legacy spread across the seas, carved into history. And yet, his story had not ended. Not truly, because in the quiet corners of the world, in the places untouched by time, there were still whispers. Whispers of a captain who had cheated death, of a ship that sailed when it should not, of a man whose reflection sometimes moved when he did not. And somewhere, beneath the waves, in the place where the past and the future intertwined, a forgotten ship drifted in the void, its crew long gone, its captain still standing at the helm, waiting, watching, for the daytime would come to claim him once more.